We are so far removed from the idea of America and its minarchism written in the United States Constitution, where we have to bring her back to where she belongs. Thank you for listening to this episode of Chasing Life, Liberty, and Minarchy. Good evening. Happy Sunday to my favorite minarchists in the world, my favorite libertarians, and newcomers to the Chasing Life, Liberty, and Minarchy show. Shout out to everybody on all of the platforms that this is broadcasting across, from YouTube to Rumble to Kick to Twitch. We got you covered, but a big shout out to all of our radio listeners in the great state of Utah, Southern Georgia, South Florida, South Carolina. Appreciate y'all for your regional support for this show. Honestly, I'm rather grateful for you guys. Some of you guys push me to the limit. Some of you don't push enough. Wait, let me take that back. I don't want you to push enough. I want you to push a lot, per se. But all in all, I still love you all 100%. I want to let's get into this real quick before we get started. Make sure you're liking, sharing, subscribing, all of that good stuff. And share it to people you may not like, people you despise. Share it to them. They might learn a little some today. As we talk about the end of permission, dismantling the licensing state. And this is, this is one of those things that people hold on to because, they think government is just this ultimate regulatory body that should administer everything that we do as people, right? And under the current system, remember, you've been with me since June, right? As we talked about what is minarchy, right? To implementing minarchy, right? To the shield of liberty, right? And then now we're here, moving beyond the shield of liberty, right? We've built our minarchist country based on the United States Constitution, right? And the use of the non-aggression axiom while doing this. So far we're building a pretty good nation here. I mean, there's a lot more nuance to this that we will continue to go further as long as the good Lord gives me breath and words to speak it. I will speak them into existence, because we all know the current system we have is not working. Well, let me take that back. It's working. It's working for who it was intended to target, right? Let's say that. It's working, but it doesn't work for the common man, right? The living man on the land, not working for them, right? Now, if you remember the previous two episodes, we talked about the archetype of consent, and we talked about market for justice, right? And that framework that allows a free society to function starts there, right? And if you haven't listened to those episodes yet, go back and listen to them, right? But even, and again, let's insert human nature in this a little bit too, right? Obviously, right? Even with perfect contract and a fair arbiter, you cannot have life and liberty if the state prevents you from entering the marketplace in the first place. Right? Today, we're going to talk about and grab the horns of the bull, right? And try to run into that invisible wall called occupational licensing. Because in the in the current landscape here in the United States, right? Roughly 25% of all workers require a government license to work. And again, that's a very huge jump from just almost 80 years ago, right? 80, yeah, about 80 years ago, right? In the 50s, where it was only 5%, right? We've allowed the state, we've allowed the state to install I'll call it a toll gate, right? Between the individual and their labor under the guise of safety. But when the state requires a license for hair braiding, interior design, or floral arrangement, we aren't talking about protection. We're talking about prior restraint. And today, right, we're going to explore ending that permission from the state, right? We're moving from a society of permitted subjects to one of a sovereign producer of goods and services, right? Now, first thing we got to do is understand how this wall was built, okay? We have to look at, first things first, we have to look at the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, okay? Let's start there. That, those of you that are not familiar, that federal law was designed to prevent cartels and restraints of trade. But however, state licensing boards have long hidden behind the state action immunity doctrine. Now you say, Rod, what's that? Well, what's all that? Well, the state action immunity doctrine actually comes from Parker versus Supreme Court case Parker versus Brown in 1943. Okay. And this doctrine allows states to bypass antitrust laws if they have a clearly articulated policy to displace competition. Right. And with that, it created the technical nuance known as Baptist and bootleggers. Right. I know some of you have heard that before and some of you haven't. So I'll kind of just briefly gloss over it real quick. Right. So you get an understanding. Right. So in this nuance, the Baptists are the well-meaning public who think the laws keep them safe, right? And the bootleggers, right, are the industry insiders who profit from the resulting monopoly, right? Now, mind you, this was actually challenged just recently in 2015 in the case of North Carolina State Board of Dental Examiners. I think I got it right. North Carolina State Board of Dental Examiners versus the FTC, where the Supreme Court ruled that if a board is controlled by active market participants, it must be actively supervised by the state to maintain immunity. I want to say that again, so you understand. I don't think you understood what I said, right? Say it again, right? The holding in this case, right? If the board is being controlled by market participants, it has to be supervised by the state to remain immune from its decisions. Now, in our Minarchy state that that we've created, we're not going to supervise the cartel. We're going to abolish that cartel, right? Because we're going to rely on a non-aggression principle, right? If you aren't physically harming anyone, the state has no life or liberty interest in blocking your business. right? Let's take let's use a wide open real world principle, African hair braiding, right? And this just happened in Mississippi, right? The board once required braiders to get a 2,000 hour cosmetology license. Yes, for hair braiding, a 2,000 hour cosmetology license in schools that didn't even teach braiding, right? The shield, remember from the Shield of Liberty, where we talked about this a little bit, right? Wasn't protecting consumers, it was protecting high price salons from low cost competition. Hmm. I think that's bogus. I mean, and that's with anything you want to do that you have the knowledge of, right? And we'll even go back. We'll go back, right? And we think about the lawyers of the day. We're talking at the founding, around the founding, years after, right? Most of the lawyers were not JDs. They weren't even DJs. I know those of you have never heard of JDs, but DJs, but you know what I mean, or MLSs. They weren't any of that. They weren't any of that. They were self-taught lawyers, and they worked with a lawyer to help refine their skills, right? Because being a lawyer, right, is a trade, right? People treat it as this lofty thing. No, being a lawyer, reading law, right, is a trade that they decided to put behind a college degree to implement their standards. But that's another conversation for another day, right? And now you can't even do that. If you like, I'll use my example, right? I have an MLS, I have a master's in legal studies. I could never practice to be a lawyer because I'd have to have that JD. Even people that have DJs, which is doctorate of jurisprudence, don't confuse that with juris doctor. Those are two different degrees, right? Unless you have that juris doctor, you can't sit for the board, right? But I went and got my MLS, right? I can read law, I can understand it. You know, y'all see it all the time on Southern Liberty when I break these things down, right? In the layman speak. But I could never stand before a judge and defend somebody. But and the only difference between me or anyone with the MLS and a JD is the fact that they took the bar. That's it. That literally is it. Just saying. Now, and again, I'm not throwing envy or hate out there or whatever, but that's just what it is. This is again, the licensing system, right? Prevents me from standing on the other side of the bar because I didn't take their bar exam, which I'm not eligible for because I don't have a Juris Doctor, right? But I digress from that part, right? The point I'm trying to make is that you can have immense knowledge and wisdom in a trade, something you've probably been doing 20 years, 30 years. It's like, hey, maybe I want to make some money off of this. No, you got to go get a license or go to school to get the license to do it and take a test from the state to go get it. We're talking a year, 2 years. It's something you've been doing for 30 years, right? 20 years, 10 years even. How is that fair that the state gets a chance to monopolize on your goods and services that you've acquired either through, obviously, you know, personal research, things of that nature, right? This is This is all I'm saying, right? When we're talking about this, right? This is why the licensing system either I go away or whatever, right? But again, we're talking about our current minarchy state. I'm just making these comparisons, right? Now, where we've gotten to, right, is this permission society, right? That relies on, I guess I would call it asymmetrical information fallacy, right? The idea because an expert knows more than the consumer, only the state can validate them, right? It's kind of what I just talked about, right? Because I, et cetera, don't have a degree, right? Because I don't have a degree, I can't become an expert, right? I don't have a certification, so I can't be an expert, right? And the consumers are more than likely smarter than the expert 90% of the time. We see it all the time, don't we? Because the consumers are actually using the products, right? But the state has to validate you. Think it's garbage, right? And think about this, right? There's this asymmetrical information fallacy has been baked in and codified in federal mandates, like the Federal Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act, right? And I can't remember, what is it called? I can't remember. One of the big ones that we don't talk about, but we talk about, but people don't know what it is. When we're I'm trying to think what it was. It's the thing we talked about with the COVID with the COVID vaccine and the different vaccines coming into the process. Oh, the FDA 510K, right? The FDA 510K, that's the clearance process, right? And it tells you in there what you need to be cleared to do X, Y, and Z, right? And those of y'all can fact check me on it. It's the FDA 510K, right? It might be L, but I think it's K for specifically, right? Because I had wrote that Ninth Amendment affidavit to the county, to Palm Beach County, when we had the whole mask thing going on and all that stuff. And I included, I think it was FDA 510K. Someone has a secondary device, fact check me on that and let me know in the comments. God, I think FDA 510K. I think so. But anyway, but these processes, right? That they have to clear you for something that you already know, right? Now, keep in mind, under our current standards, right? If you develop a medical device, you are literally legally forbidden from selling it until you prove substantial equivalence to a predicate device. I think that's the wording is right. That is already on the market, right? This creates this creates a technical paradox, right? I think I'd call it, right. To innovate, you must prove you are just like what already exists, right? That's more on the lines of a top-down mandate, right? That literally will kill innovation through cost and delay, right? But watch this, right? Let's talk about minarchy a second, right? Because we are producing our minarchy state here, right? So what we would do in our minarchy state, right? We would remove that government oversight, right? And create competitive certification. Because now in our minarchist framework, right, we would replace the federal monopolies with the reputation market. Okay. While what's it called? Oh God, what's the law called? See, I'm having a brain freeze, y'all. NTTAA, which is the National Technology Transfer and Advancement Act. Okay. That act actually encourages federal agencies to use private sector standards, and the state still keeps the final veto on that, right? In our minarchist state, we remove that veto. We completely remove it, right? Manufacturers under our framework, right, choose to be certified by private bodies like UL, right, Underwriters Laboratories, right, or ASC. Why? Because because of the market, right? If you see your mechanic is ASC certified, you'll have a little bit more trust than the shade tree mechanic on the corner. But then again, I don't know where you live, but I know I'll say this: I know where I live. I would trust the shade tree mechanic. I mean, that's just how we get down out here in rural America, rural Florida, right? That guy on the corner has probably got 8 or 9 trucks that is running that he built himself, right? I'm gonna trust the guy down the street that built his engine for his big truck to fix my joint before an ASC technician for many reasons. I don't know that guy, but I've seen that guy in his work, right? Anyway, this is what I'm talking about, right? It's the market. Retailers, banks, insurance companies, right? They demand this, right? In fact, in fact, right? Let's think about this a minute, right? Liability insurance becomes the primary de facto regulator, right? Because an insurer won't underwrite a hospital using uncertified equipment because a financial risk is too high, right? The signal, hello, woohoo, woohoo, of a private certificate is a technical requirement for participating in the economy. And if a provider lies about it, it's fraud, right? The theft of trust, right? I'm glad y'all still hanging out this with me here. We're doing the things. I appreciate y'all. Make sure y'all liking, sharing, subscribing. And please remember, we do have the wonderful Ninth Amendment Project doing its thing. So I hope you guys have looked at it, all that good stuff. We'll run it at the bottom of the screen for the rest of the show so you get what it is, ninthamendmentproject.org. We're doing the things. We're trying to do big things with it. I appreciate y'all support. Just reading it, whatever the case may be, so we can defend our unenumerated rights and liberties that the state have taken from us and they shouldn't have by statute. So, with that, right, we come to now the final technical piece of our puzzle, right? The shift from ex ante regulation, right, which is basically regulating before the fact, right, to ex post accountability, right, holding people responsible after the fact. And we have a problem doing that even in our current system in our country. We have a problem with holding people responsible after the fact. I mean, look at Fauci. He's still running out here loose. Dr. Burks, they're running out here loose, and all the other quack jobs that try to silence others that may have a counter narrative and evidence, right? There is no accountability after the fact, right? See, we have to remember the United States, right? We're all y'all probably heard me say this before, right? In our current system, the office of the U.S. president is a de facto dictatorship, and y'all have heard my reasons why for saying that, right? I don't care who is sitting in that seat. I don't care if it's Donald Trump. I don't care if it's Biden, Obama, Bush, Clinton, Reagan, Ford, Carter, Nixon, Coolidge. I don't care. Since 1946, the office of the U.S. president has been operating as a de facto dictatorship because the United States is operating under the Administrative Procedures Act. right? Remember, the Administrative Procedures Act granted executive branch agencies like the FDA and OSHA and the EPA the power to act as prosecutor, judge, and executioner, right? If you violate a regulation, you aren't brought before a jury. You actually appear before an administrative law judge, which is an employee of the agency accusing you, right? Enforcement. Remember when we brought this in, right? When they sign this into law, right? I want you to understand me clearly here, right? Enforcement under administrative law becomes about compliance, not restitution. If you are fined, that money goes to the treasury and the actual victim sees nothing. I want you to think about that a second. The executive branch can make regulation that carries the weight of law that can take money out of your pocket. There's no actual court, right? There's no actual court here. It's an employee of the agency that's the judge. Now, let's talk about our minarchist state, right? Because we're building our minarchist state, right? We're building our freedom state, right? So what we do in our minarchist state is we replace the administrative state with a strict tort liability, right? We move from what is an inefficient bureaucracy trying to prevent mistakes, which treats every citizen like a preemptive criminal, right? Think about that. Think about RRS, right? If they have an inkling you didn't pay your taxes, that audit, you are a preemptive criminal, right? But we move, right? Again, we move away from the administrative state in this manner, right? And we move to a robust private court system focused on making the victim whole. Because that's what it's all about, right? That's what justice is about, right? Justice is not about the government stepping in with their monopoly on violence to force compliance. And the victim sees nothing. The person people are actually hurt, right? Under 1 USC 1, the Dictionary Act, right? They don't see there's no restitution. It's only compliance, and the money goes to the government. How is that justice? Right? Another example, let's look at the cottage food revolution, right? Over 40 states bypassed the heavy-handed factory standards of the FDA Food Safety Modernization Act, right? Which was implied on small producers, right? Remember, statists predicted mass illness, but it never happened, right? Why? Because when you remove the regulatory shield, the producer is 100% liable, okay? See, in our minarchist state, if a baker sells tainted bread, they just don't get a $500 fine as a cost of doing business. They face a strict liability lawsuit in a private court for medical bills, lost wages, and suffering, right? We would replace the bureaucrat's clipboard with the judge's gavel, right? Which makes accountability the ultimate shield for the consumer. In closing, when we move beyond the shield, right, we're doing more than just cutting red tape or debating legal theory. We are making a fundamental declaration about what it means to be a human being. We are declaring that the right to earn a living isn't a gift from the state. It is an inherent property right in oneself. Going back to the right to the doctrine of self-ownership, which is the very first property right, right? Every time you accept a license for a low-risk trade, you are implicitly agreeing that your life and liberty are actually just leases from a politician that can be revoked at any time, right? The current under our current standard, right? It operates on the precautionary principle, right? The idea that you should be stopped until you prove you are harmless, right? You are guilty until you prove yourself innocent, right? Sounds kind of whack, doesn't it? Right? But in our minarchist society, our minarchist country that we're created, right? We're operating on trust and accountability, right? Because we recognize that the shield is there to protect your person, but the end of permission is what frees your potential. See, when the state stops acting as the architect of the marketplace, it forces us to grow. It demands that we become maximal individuals, right? People taking pride in their reputation, people who respect their contracts, and people who don't need a bureaucrat's stamp to validate their value to their neighbors. I have something for my fellow minarchist studiers. I know that's not a word. I just had to be funny. I want you to go to your state's licensing website, right? Then I want you to look up the North Carolina dental case that I talked about earlier, right? Audit your own local boards. If you see a board filled with active competitors who have the power to block new people from working without active state supervision, they are likely violating federal antitrust law. Also, look into the training hours in your state. If it takes 1,500 hours to learn to cut hair, but only 150 to learn how to save a life in an ambulance, you're looking at a cartel, not a safety standard, right? That 1,300-hour gap is a tax on the soul of every person trying to climb the economic ladder. The shield, remember the shield of liberty we talked about in the last series? That is our defense. That shield is the defense. And the marketplace is our playground. We have to stop the overseers and the politicians and these regulatory bodies. We have to stop them from telling us how to play our own game. Remember, in a minarchist state, this wouldn't happen. With that being said, thank y'all. I appreciate y'all a lot for tuning in. Hopefully you get this and you share this with your friends and letting them know, as they like to say, what you learned today. If you learned anything today, go ahead and share that with your your peoples, I would greatly appreciate it. I would greatly, greatly appreciate it. With that being said, y'all, listen, y'all have a great night. Enjoy the rest of your weekend and do what you do to it. And remember, love your neighbors, love your family, but ultimately, you got to love yourself. Until next time, y'all, peace and love.